Well, okay, we are back with our third edition of Anglican FAQ, a ministry of Holy Cross Cathedral in Loganville, Georgia. Today we have the question right here. What does the New Testament say about tithes, and does it supersede Mosaic law? I've got Hoback Fisher back, lay teacher and parishioner here at Holy Cross. He has done an awesome job. He's got a very thoughtful answer to this question, and I love the way that Hoback focuses on the gospel and how giving is part of understanding our freedom in Christ and the generosity that flows out of that. Enjoy Hoback's answer.
What does the New Testament teach about the tithe, and does it supersede the Mosaic law? To answer this question, we ask what the Mosaic law teaches, and then what the New Testament teaches. Finally, we ask how they inform each other. In summary, both Old and New Testaments are united in professing Jesus Christ as Lord. He is Lord of our possessions, and all our possessions are originally His. We are taught to recognize this by tithing as an act of worship. This is good news. God's salvation is not just for our souls, but for our bodies and our entire human life. Therefore, His instructions to us teach on all facets of the human life, the dollars entrusted to us included. In multiple places, Moses records God's clear command that all Israelites are to give 10% of all their income to the Levites. Some of this tithe supported the Levites themselves, who did not receive anything when the other 11 tribes divided up the promised land. Some of this was ultimately used as a burnt offering. Lots of the tithe was actually consumed by the tither on one of Israel's annual feasts in Jerusalem. So the tithe was presented as an act of worship, and an act of worship that actually facilitated the worship of the entire nation. Beyond this, Moses commands charitable giving through a set of specific practices. So, for example, farmers were instructed to leave the edges of their fields unharvested so that the poor could glean food from them. And the entire nation was called to give charitably to widows and orphans, immigrants and sojourners. There were also standards about forgiving crippling debt. The Old Testament lauds those who gave generously according to this standard. In the book of Ruth, Boaz dutifully leaves the margins of his fields unharvested, and the poor Ruth gleans the grain. They eventually marry. One of their descendants, King David, gives abundantly for the building of God's temple out of his own wealth, and he sets an example for his countrymen to do the same. And his far descendant, Jesus Christ, gave lavishly of his life for all Christian people. So the image is pretty clear. Generosity is not merely a command, but an act of worship that plays a central role in God's plan of salvation. Of course, all Israel did not tithe, and all Israel was not generous. And the Old Testament prophets make it clear that this displeased God as much as any other sin, like adultery or theft. Failure to tithe and give generously was one of the reasons Israel was sent into exile. Many people ask whether or not these two forms of giving are still the standard today, and this is a reasonable question. The New Testament contains no passage explicitly commanding the tithe. Additionally, both Moses and Paul teach that there are aspects of the Mosaic law that are only temporary, and after Jesus, many of its ceremonial and civil components are no longer needed. For examples, neither the Mosaic dietary restrictions nor circumcision are expected today. But it's important to note a couple things. First, the Mosaic law was given hundreds of years after God made promises to Abraham and his descendants. Christians today are children of Abraham by faith and inherit the covenant God made with him. Abraham and his grandson Jacob both tithed, and the 7th chapter of the book of Hebrews discusses this at length, commending tithing as a part of the morally upright life. Additionally, the New Testament implicitly teaches both the tithe and the obligation to give charitably. Consider the Old Testament commands against adultery and murder. These are expanded by Jesus himself to include prohibitions against lustful and hateful thoughts. So it is no surprise the New Testament takes the specific commands of the Mosaic law as regards giving and broadens their moral scope, binding all Christians to give sacrificially of their resources to both church and the tithe and to society and charity. The detailed commands about giving in the Old Testament conceal within them a moral principle, and Christ reveals this principle more vividly in the light of his incarnation and empowers his people to meet this higher standard. This is why so many of the passages in the New Testament commend both types of giving laid out in the Old. St. Paul explicitly teaches that Christians are bound to give of their material resources to support the function of the church, and this is directly analogous to the Mosaic tithe. Likewise, the moral expectation of charity is well established by example and direct command. Consider the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the ministry of the first deacons appointed in the book of Acts. St. Paul's relationship with the church of Corinth is also particularly illuminating. He writes to the Corinthians clearly asserting his right to material support from them. He waives this right for the sake of his witness, and then simultaneously asks the church to give alms for the poor in Jerusalem, clearly showing the two categories of Christian giving. So the answer to the question is that the New Testament teaches that Christians should tithe to the church and give charitably. This supersedes the Mosaic law in the sense that the standard is actually now higher and clearer than it was before the Incarnation. If you have more questions about this, please approach a priest or submit a question to Anglican FAQ. If you are struggling to tithe for any reason, recall a few things. First, Christian priests and bishops today are successors of St. Paul, who waived his expectation of the tithe for the sake of his own Christian witness. So no pastor should ever look down on anyone who is legitimately struggling to tithe. Second, the biblical witness presents tithing not as a burden, but as a joyful participation in God's plan of salvation and the joyful worship of his people. So let this be your motivations to start giving in whatever small way, wherever possible. Third, the only one truly able to give, according to the Christian standard of generosity, is Jesus Christ himself. When we offer our best generosity and faith, it is joined to his, and through him we are incorporated into God's generosity to the whole world. And this is good news.